This episode of Bullet Heaven was made possible with a copy of the game provided by Flump Studios. Space Invaders has been a shiny beacon on the shooting landscape for over 40 years. Somehow, though, new concepts on its ancient formula are still seeing release all this time later. In 2015, Flump Studios released an Invaders-inspired game called Horizon Shift, which spiced up the Invaders core formula with a split Yoko playfield and a switchable fire direction. Horizon Shift 81 is a follow-up to this game published in December 2018 by Funbox Media on the Nintendo Switch. Featuring a split Tate setup this time, how does it shake things up? How does it fare? Let's take a closer look. The gameplay in Horizon Shift 81 might seem very familiar to anyone who's played a Space Invaders game in the last 40 years, but it incorporates a number of extra functions that modernizes the gameplay, even if it feels as if it belongs in another decade. Primarily, players will move their ship left and right using either the directional buttons or the left analog stick. The player's movement rate is pretty solid all things considered and allows for adequate coverage of any given stage. But the player's plane of movement is fixed to a central line, which is where things get a little more interesting. Enemies will approach the player from the top and the bottom of the screen. Pressing either up or down will point the player's ship in the chosen direction to deal with the opposition making its way towards the player on either side of the central horizon. Enemy types are many and varied, and players will often not be able to take out all of the enemies on both sides, even with quick reflexes. There will be times that enemies make their way to the horizon with various effects. Some will sit on the line, while others, like the exploding worm enemies or asteroids, will punch holes into it. Others still will move from left to right. Players have the ability to jump by pressing the B button, which can be used to traverse holes in the horizon or jump over various foes. Of course, if a player can't miss a hole, they will fall to their doom, both down and up, depending on where they are on the horizon. In the case of enemies, though, players can also opt for a quick dash maneuver which allows players to barrel through and defeat enemies that happen to be on the player's horizon. Certain obstacles can also be flung into the playfield. The dash can be performed with any of the 4 shoulder buttons on the Switch controller by default. Care should be taken though. A cooldown period associated with the dash, indicated by a white bar just above the player's ship, needs to be taken into account. Players can also chain dashes if enough enemies are taken out at once. This powerful attack also factors into scoring, which we'll take a look at shortly. Along the way, a number of special weapons and enhancements will become available to the player. Various special weapons like flamethrowers, shotguns, heavy shots, rockets, guns with variable angles, and more are available by picking up a power-up icon in red. Each of these weapons has a contracted descriptor allowing the player to determine whether the new weapon will be helpful to them at the time or not. Some specific weapons also slow the player's movement while firing, which absolutely factors into how effective they are at the time. Blue enhancements can also be picked up in this manner too. Double and triple jumps, extra dash power, satellite drones, extra turrets, and more will enhance the player's ability to better avoid enemies, break through them, and keep firepower flowing. While all of this is happening, a red gauge will fill up as any pickup on screen is collected. When full, a damaging screen-clearing bomber can be deployed with the X button. It's actually recommended that players perform at least 2 bombers as soon as they can, as a special hyper attack can also be collected and deployed in much the same way. However, the hyper is much more powerful than the standard bomber. Horizon Shift 81 takes place over the course of 36 progressively harder, timed stages. Even if all of the enemies on screen aren't dealt with, if the stage's invisible time limit is reached, they will all be destroyed and the next stage will start. Checkpoints can also be reached for players to continue any time, even if the game is totally closed out, which is nice given the portable nature of the Switch. Along the way, several boss encounters will also challenge the player to take out a hulking enemy using various techniques at various points on the playfield. Players can also rescue aliens that enter the playfield and fall or rise towards the horizon. If they reach the horizon, they'll be destroyed, but if 5 are rescued, a breakout-style bonus round will commence, which tasks players with taking out an alien mini-boss in this alternate gameplay style. Some bricks will drop bombs which can be launched at other bricks by dashing into them, but lose the main ball and it's back to normal stages. Additional game modes that challenge the player to take on the game with just 1 life, others that speed up the action on screen, and the additional unlockable boss rush and free modes add a good amount of choice to the player's game preference as well. But all is not as it seems. All of the mechanics and factors more or less work fine on their own, and for the most part, Horizon Shift 81 is pretty solid, at least on the outset. But things take a turn for the frustrating around the midway point of the game's 36 stages when indestructible enemies that require enemy shots to be reflected with a dash, which travel exclusively along the horizon, paired with asteroids and crisscrossing lasers and full enemy patterns all happening on both sides of the player's horizon all at once, well, it basically coalesces into an infuriating mess. Especially when the horizon starts to move higher and lower on the playfield, it can lead to some controller-shattering frustration. And the game's mechanics themselves aren't totally at fault here. We never actually felt comfortable with the control setup in general, which will often have the player unintentionally flip their ship to a side of the horizon they may not want to be on. Jumping downwards on the bottom half of the horizon also feels a little counterintuitive as well, despite the directionals remaining the same. Unfortunately, the other control schemes feel equally questionable. The bonus stages are also a completely superfluous, almost pointless addition. For example, the ball often moves way faster than the player can, resulting in misses that happen far too frequently for us to really bother with these stages. A simple alien collect bonus with harder to rescue aliens might have been a better choice. We also really didn't like the rumble when starting up the game. It's long and drawn out, and we thought our controllers were freaking out at first. Then we just generally got annoyed with it. We ended up just turning the rumble off. Now, we definitely know there are going to be people out there that really dig Horizon Shift 81, and it's definitely far from being terrible on a technical level, but there is definitely a lot going on here that doesn't jive with us. And that kind of keeps it from being especially good in our eyes. So how does scoring add to the experience? The scoring in Horizon Shift 81 has its hooks, but ends up being generally simple. Of course, enemy destruction will add to the score in a decent manner, especially in the case of bosses. But the best way to get a huge payout is to use the dash mechanic. Dashing through a huge group of enemies will result in a point payout that starts at 500 points and mounts to a maximum of 8,000 points. These points can be collected as long as the boost barrier exists, which can be used to take out more and more foes on either side of the horizon. This dash chaining allows for a lot of enemies to be taken out in this way, but the cooldown bar can interfere with this mechanic. Additional point bonuses for up to 8,000 points can also be collected just like power-ups and enhancements and add to the bomber gauge as well. Some enemies produce obstacles that move along the horizon, which can also help in getting larger point payouts. Dashing into these spiky shots will launch them upwards or downwards from the horizon. If they impact an enemy, the player will get double the points. Some enemies in the shape of a shuriken also do the same thing. Enabling a bonus round is also a decent way to get extra points, though maximizing their value is, by design, very difficult to do. At the very least, it does result in some free pointage for every block destroyed. But that's more or less all there is to the scoring in this game. There's no online or even local leaderboards here, only a high score at the top of the screen that shows players what the best score achieved actually is. We believe that this is sure to hurt the staying power of Horizon Shift 81, especially given its issues and solo nature. Oftentimes, the presentation of a game can save it from mediocrity if things aren't as great as they could have been in terms of mechanics. On the other side of things, a game with brilliant gameplay can be stunted with really irritating sound and bad visuals. So where does that leave Horizon Shift 81? Well, on the visual side, there's kind of a mismatch of things going on here. There are some cool CRT effects like a simulated curve to the playfield, various glow effects, both vertical and horizontal scan lines, and more, which work well with the pixel-style visuals here. But then there are the backgrounds and bomber attacks and larger shots, which are really high resolution. It kind of breaks the theme a bit. The enemy designs are sufficiently diverse, but most if not all of them aren't much to write home about from a design standpoint. The overabundance of simple rotation that makes up the majority of the animation in Horizon Shift 81 also makes it look and feel a little on the cheap side. The giant rotating clip art style skull during the bomber attack doesn't help matters. Sound-wise, Horizon Shift 81 is more or less hit or miss. Some tracks like the Stage 1 track is pretty great. The title screen and Stage 25 music, which are the same track mind you, is also fairly good. But most everything else? Meh. The guitar-style tracks don't match the game's presentation at all. Why not go for a right proper synthwave or chiptune soundtrack instead? The sound effects are also way too overdriven. Especially when all the enemies on the screen poof when the stage changes over, the sound buzzes and distorts with way too much volume for the master sound channel to handle, even when reduced. A bunch of irritating effects also poke through the din, making for a less than pleasant oral experience. There are still some merits here though. Full Tate support is featured for those with the means to play vertically oriented games at home or on the go. The menus themselves are easy to understand and navigate. And some really cool wallpapers are also available for those people that prefer playing in a horizontal fashion, which ends up squishing the screen into a tiny portion of the overall display. So how does Horizon Shift 81 stack up? Let's take a look. We really can't get behind the controls in Horizon Shift 81. The best setup ends up pointing the ship in directions we don't want, and the other options feel bizarre and unnatural. We're sure some players will be able to acclimate, but we've never felt comfortable with what's here. Horizon Shift 81 definitely gets challenging, but mostly because of the loose controls and wonky mechanics. It may have 36 stages, but the lack of co-op and online scoring will seriously stunt Horizon Shift 81's staying power. If it were 100% pixel art and if it had more personality, Horizon Shift 81 would be a visual winner. What's here is still decent, but not great. Some of the music tracks in Horizon Shift 81 are brilliant, but unfortunately it's all weighed down by other not-so-great BGM and overdriven, annoying sound effects. The weapon system and the idea of jumping and dashing is neat, but the game feels too crowded with all of the ideas and functions crammed into a game that needs more finesse. Unsurprisingly, Taito's original series still holds the gold standard, and Space Invaders Extreme still does it best. At $10 US, Horizon Shift 81's price is acceptable, though better games can definitely be had for less. I wish I could have liked Horizon Shift 81 more. There was a lot of promise to the concept that just feels loose and unstable in practice. In the end, Horizon Shift 81 gets a 3 out of 5. You can get a copy of Horizon Shift 81 for about $10 US on the Nintendo eShop. I think it's finally time to take a look at some classic titles. What do you say? First up, a game that I've wanted to review for a solid decade. See you in episode 233.